There were two couples who lived in a compound. The Awonises lived in a flat, while the Olatejus lived in a self-contained apartment, both in the same compound. Their friendship was initiated by Mrs. Awonise's constant borrowing of household items. She would go to Mrs. Olateju's house and call her endearing names, only to end it with a request. At first, Mrs. Olateju got surprised as to how a woman who lives in a flat and whose husband has a car enjoys borrowing from a less privileged couple. But being a kind person, she would always give what she could afford. They later became friends due to several interactions. Mr. Olateju is an employee and he comes back home every weekend. His house is quite far from his workplace. They have two children. The Awonises have 4 kids. Mrs. Awonise has a supermarket opened for her by her husband. She employed a sales girl, but she doesn't go there more than once a week. Whenever her husband queries her, she claims the place is too far and she has 4 kids to take care of. Mrs. Olateju, on the other hand, is a hairstylist. She has no shop, but because she's so good at it and charges a little, her customers patronize her at home. Mrs. Awonise would go to sit with Mrs. Olateju and gist with her while she plats customers' hair. Mrs. Awonise is a very fashionable woman. She has clothes in different colors, lengths, and shapes. Her hair collection is wow. She has the rich wife vibe. The one thing that is appalling about her is how she borrows salt and maggi from Mrs. Olateju, who isn't as privileged as her. One day, while the two women were gisting, Mrs. Olateju picked her phone and made a call. It was a call to the extra lesson teacher that teaches her children who attend public schools. They can't afford to put their kids in private schools, so Mrs. Olateju always ensures they get into the best public school in town. This she achieves by giving them intense reading preparations. She reduces their playtime drastically whenever they are in primary 6. She calls the lesson teacher every day to know if her children made themselves available. She would also call to know when they leave. Her children had no choice but to keep going. After the strict discipline she gave them each time their teacher said they didn't come, Mrs. Awonise yawned as she watched her friend make the call. After the call, Mrs. Olateju asked her when she would be going to pick her children for school. She replied that she wouldn't be going until 2 hours' time. She said she was tired and needed to sleep. So, what will they be doing in school? Asked Mrs. Olateju. Let them play with their friends. I am tired, she said tiredly as she stood up and went to her flat. Mrs. Olateju watched her in awe. Mrs. Awonise picks up her children very late from school. The children would play and play. Their uniform would look so dirty by the time they got home. Mr. Awonise had seen it happen 1 or 2 times and he queried his wife on both occasions. He usually comes in late at night, so he isn't usually privy to most occurrences in his home. The Awonises are a couple that lived for the glam without the real substance. They invested in buying flashy things, yet their kids get chased from school due to late payment of fees. They rode a flashy car, yet there have been 2 occasions of them being threatened by the caretaker to eject them. They make funny spending decisions. One of them is sending their children to a very distant school that wears out Mrs. Awonise every day, which was one of the reasons she drags her feet to go pick them up. Mrs. Olateju had asked her why they couldn't enroll them in one of the many schools around, but she claimed they were not exquisite enough. Mrs. Olateju, on the other hand, doesn't do pass herself. Her children attend one of the secondary schools close by. She sometimes checks in on them unannounced. She doesn't have a culture of borrowing needlessly from her neighbors, unlike Mrs. Awonise. She carried herself so exquisitely. Even richer neighbors in the compound respected her. One morning, Mrs. Olateju was outside her apartment, hurrying her children to come out and go to school. She saw Mrs. Awonise hurrying out of her flat apprehensively, dashing towards the gate. Mrs. Olateju wanted to ask if she was fine, but she was in such a hurry. Mrs. Olateju wondered what could be wrong with her. She later got to know that Mrs. Awonise's shop was burgled the previous night. Her sales girl had forgotten to lock the door, giving easy access to whoever did the operation. A lot of her goods were carted away. Mrs. Awonise cried a river. Her husband pointed accusing fingers at her, telling her he warned her about her lack of attention for her business. He walked out of the living room angrily. Mrs. Olateju comforted Mrs. Awonise, who was crying loudly. Mr. decided he wasn't going to sponsor any business for her anymore. Already, the finances of the family weighed heavily on him, and he was beginning to lose control of his finances. Inflation. One afternoon, Mrs. Awonise got lost in her thoughts while in Mrs. Olateju's balcony. Mrs. Olateju asked her what was wrong. She replied that her husband was about to change her children to a cheaper school, which didn't go down well with her. According to her, cheaper means less standard. Mrs. Olateju advised her that he must have had his reason for suggesting it. She had to accept his idea. Mrs. Awonise argued on. She said it would amount to her enemies mocking her. After a series of failed efforts, Mrs. Olateju stopped talking. By the way, I have wanted to ask you a question. Why is it that your children hardly play in this compound? Sometimes it's as if they don't even live here, asked Mrs. Awonise. You are exaggerating. They play a lot on weekends, but their midweek play is very minimal. That's because I have a timetable I placed them on, Mrs. Olateju replied. Timetable? Mrs. Awonise asked. Yes, there is time to play on our timetable, Mrs. Olateju replied. Mrs. Awonise looked at her in shock. Mr. Olateju comes home every weekend, and he does nothing else except be with his family. He doesn't go on outings or clubbings. Weekends with him are always memorable because he makes them count. Mr. Awonise, on the other hand, comes back home late every day. He would come back from work around 8, go meet his friends at the club, and stay out until midnight. The children basically had very low interactions with him. Mrs. Olateju's children get to play well on weekends. The Awonise children always looked forward to it because they were always busy on weekends. One day, Mrs. Awonise commented that Mrs. Olateju's children always dressed exquisitely as though they were going to one serious secondary school, not knowing it's a public school they are going. She laughed. Mrs. Olateju felt hurt, but kept it to herself. Mrs. Olateju excels in parenting. No wonder her children are top in their respective classes. When they get home by 4 p.m., she distributes chores to them and ensures they do it at her own time. They take dinner by 6:30. She guides them to do their assignments. This is where she checks their handwriting to see if they are on track. She is a lover of good handwriting, and she scolds her children if they don't follow suit. She lets them go to bed by 7 p.m. By 10 p.m. she wakes them and stays with them. She makes them read for 1 hour 30 minutes while she studies her Bible. Go back to bed thereafter. Our children spend their holidays learning skills. A part of their holiday for children camping, where they learn social skills and Christian ethics. Mrs. Olateju is so detailed. She knows the number of social activities and clubs that are available in her children's school. She encouraged her children on the social activities they should participate in, and she follows up on it. Mrs. Awonise, on the other hand, isn't as detailed. She doesn't pick up her children until very late in the evening. They would play, and when they get home, they will still bring out their balls to play. On weekends, she takes them to one birthday or the other. She leaves them there and goes back home to sleep. thus leaving them to interact with strangers. Also, the children get sent out like 3 times in a term before their school fees get completed, making them miss out on lectures on those days. Aside that, they are well taken care of. They take food, snacks, and money to school daily. Mrs. Olateju is a lover of fashion, so she buys a lot of clothes for them regularly. The Olateju's children sometimes see this and they get jealous. Their mother buys them second-hand clothes at the end of the term when they get their results. It is always a motivation for them to work hard. Also, the Awonises have a culture of watching movies first thing in the morning before dressing up for school. Mrs. Olateju had noticed this when on 2 occasions she passed by their flat in the morning to fetch water. She found it odd and has corrected her friend that morning time should be used to teach the children the word of God. Mrs. Awonise would respond that she didn't subscribe to such ancient ways of parenting. The children are starved of teachings that would impact their character. No wonder their teachers had ill reports about them daily. Mrs. Awonise was with Mrs. Olateju one day, gisting with her as usual. Then, absent-mindedly, Mrs. Awonise eased as she stared at her phone. All these fake scholarships, she muttered. Mrs. Olateju asked her what she meant. She then explained that a scholarship site usually popped up on her screen, but she has refused to enroll her children because she believes it is fake. According to her, they had tried some in the past that didn't work. Mrs. Olateju collected her phone and got the details. "I will try my luck," she said. Later in the evening that day, Mrs. Olateju went to the scholarship website and took her time to research on the requirements. The requirements were tough. It entailed 3 straight terms of being among the 3 best students in class. There would be a test on their oral skills and a character test. They gave no time for the assessment. It would be sudden. Also, they said the application must be done by the school, not an individual. Mrs. Olateju got up in the morning, went to school and met with the principal, discussed the issue with him, and he promised to help. 3 weeks later, no step had been taken by the school. Mrs. Olateju got worried. The scholarship has a time frame, and she was getting irritated by the delay. The next day, she went to the principal with a bunch of plantains, greeted him, and had a funny chit-chat with him. She gave him her gift before revisiting the issue. The principal got the website address from her and other details on how to apply. He did the application on his laptop in her presence. Mrs. Olateju went home happily. Her firstborn, who is in GS2, met the initial requirement, which was being one of the 3 best students in the class repeatedly for 3 terms. The other assessments would be done by the agency. The details were not communicated to them. Mrs. Olateju went home happily and started preparing her daughter on oral skills. Tofumi had always been a great orator, but since she didn't know the topic they would accost her with, her mother gave her debate topics on different fields of life. She practiced with her and had mini debates with her at home. 4 weeks later, Mrs. Akinwande, their English language teacher, came into the class to teach. Suddenly, she stopped and threw a question at the class. With detailed explanation, I want someone to explain the role of inflation in students' education. She held her phone and acted like she was doing something on it. While waiting for students to raise their hands, for the first few seconds, no one raised their hands. "Nobody has the answer," she said, went back to doing something on her phone. Suddenly, Tofumi Olateju stood up. Like a lawyer, she did justice to the topic with great oratory skills and gesticulations. She gave a 10-minute talk on the topic. Mrs. Akinwande kept pressing her phone, and her students wondered why the attitude. After a period elapsed, she left. The next week, a young man came into the school. A stranger. Tofumi had just finished from her private lesson teacher and was walking towards the gate. The young man stopped her and greeted her. He told her he was going to the principal's office and asked for a description. Tofumi wanted to take him there, but he declined, asking her to describe. The principal's office is actually in the interior part of the school, and a lot of adjectives are needed for proper description. The stranger watched her. Okay, sir, just walk down the road. You come across a roundabout. Walk towards the left side of the road for a few minutes. Then you will see a curve. Follow that path. You will see a staircase adjacent the road. Move to the building and walk up the staircase. On getting to the top floor, proceed to the block of offices by the right. Count 3 offices and you'll be standing in front of the principal's office when you get to the 4th office. The young man looked in admiration at her great English speaking and description skills, which wasn't common in public schools. He nodded his head, appreciated her, and followed the description. Tofumi went on her way. 2 weeks later, a mail was sent to Mrs. Olateju that her daughter had qualified for the scholarship. She jumped up in shock as she read on. Her education, down to her final year in the university, would be catered for. She was to come for the award-winning ceremony the next weekend and also sign some documents. Mrs. Olateju jumped for joy and screamed. Mrs. Awonise heard the noise and came to her. She shared with her the good news. Mrs. Awonise couldn't believe her ears as she took the phone to read the mail. She tried to be a killjoy. Are you sure this isn't fake? This kind of scholarship is for people with connections, not the poor, because they even sponsor their beneficiaries abroad for their tertiary education. You sure say this mail no misread? Mrs. Olateju was quiet and considered what she said for some seconds. I will find out for myself. Next week at the award ceremony, she said. Her mood had changed. The D-Day came. Mrs. Olateju took Tofumi to the location, and it was a very private event with about 10 students in their uniforms and some dignitaries in the course of the event. She got to know that 10 students were the lucky winners from across the state. Mrs. Olateju wondered how they did the assessments that qualified her daughter. In the course of the event, a young man came up stage to talk. Tofumi saw him and was shocked. It was the man that asked her for the principal's office the other day. Other students too looked shocked. He cleared their confusion by telling them that the visitation to their school was purposely for them. They had liaised with their teachers, gotten their pictures, they got information about likely place and time to meet them. He also mentioned that their English teachers were used to test them. The students screamed, "Ow!" The young man paused, smiling. The impact of inflation in students' education. Do you remember that topic? They screamed, "Yes." Do you remember your teachers had phones in their hands while you were talking? They screamed, "Yes." Yeah, we sent them. They got your videos and sent your answers to us. The students were in shock. Mrs. Olateju was too. She was amazed at their master plan. After the event, they were treated to expensive cuisines. They were marched into some exquisite offices to get the proper documentations. To Mrs. Olateju's delight, it was real. It wasn't a lie like Mrs. Awonise made her believe. Her daughter would be sponsored abroad for her degree by the scholarship scheme. She went home, rolled on the floor, and thanked God with tears. Her children knelt beside her to praise God. School closed for the section the next day. 2 of Mrs. Awonise's children were told to repeat their classes, while two were promoted on trial. Her husband rained fire and brimstone on her that night, shouting at his wife for being a terrible mother who didn't monitor the children. Mrs. Olateju sat in front of her apartment, listening and shaking her head. If only this woman had listened to all my suggestions to be a better mother, she muttered.